Today we're going to share 5 tips with you that will help keep you injury-free. We know one of the frustrations with running is potentially the injury aspect of things. No one likes to sit on the sidelines when we should be out there or could be out there running. I'm Devlin Eden from CoachParry.com, and I'm going to hand over to Lindsay now to discuss the first tip.
Preventing injury is all about managing your training load. And I think the most important aspect to controlling that training load is to actually monitor your own response to that training load, because that will really give you a good idea if you are recovering well enough from your current training load, if you need to pull back, or if you are in a position to increase that training load. At Coach Parry, we use 3 tools to really monitor whether we are recovering well from training load. The first is really easy, but it does require a little bit of experience, and that's just being really honest about how do I feel. If you are really finding it a struggle to take a flight of stairs when you go to the local shopping mall or the office, you probably are on the bubble of the training load being too high. You certainly don't want to be putting in any high intensity training sessions, and you possibly want to look at adjusting the overall training load in your week. If there's actual pain, so we take the next step of how do I feel, my legs are sore, my muscles are sore, that is a real clear indication that in this week you've definitely overdone the training load, and it's very important that you then pull back that training load. I certainly wouldn't do any running while my legs are sore, but you might want to look at doing some gentle non-impact exercise like easy cycling or swimming. If we then dive into a little bit more of our physiological responses, quite a good way of picking up even before you feel whether you are starting to take on too much load is to actually monitor your resting heart rate. Now this will only work if it's something that you do regularly through your training when you are feeling good and when you are feeling not so good. And what we're really looking for is when that resting heart rate starts to go up. As you get fitter and stronger in our training, your resting heart rate might come down a little bit, but there's a fairly strong genetic link to that resting heart rate. What we don't want to see is that resting heart rate going up. So if your resting heart rate is around 4 or 5 beats higher than your normal resting, that's a sign that you possibly are going into a little bit of overtraining. The load is too high, so you maybe want to do a day or two of very easy exercise or take a day off. If that heart rate shoots beyond that to say 8 or 10 beats higher than normal, that's a very clear sign that you have definitely overdone it. The load is too high. You definitely want to implement a couple of days of rest until that resting heart rate starts to come back down. And then finally, with your modern wearable devices, you can use something called heart rate variability. It is more sensitive than resting heart rate, but again, it's something that you have to monitor over a longer period of time, because we do have some unique physiological responses. But as a pretty good rule of thumb, that heart rate variability is really the interplay between our excitatory and inhibitory nervous systems, and they have quite a high interplay between each other when we are in balance or well recovered. And so you have a high heart rate variability. When you've got low heart rate variability, that typically tells us that one of those nervous systems is taking charge or taking control or overly dominant, and they fight each other and slowly bring us back to equilibrium. So low heart rate variability can indicate stress. High heart rate variability generally tells us that we are doing quite well, and obviously again it's something that you want to be able to measure over time so that you are comparing it to periods in which you were healthy and feeling good, so that will then tell you if you need to rest, recover, or drop your training loads.
I know as runners we love running, and more often than not that's all we want to do, but one of the biggest things we can add to our training is strength training. Strength training helps prepare the body for the loads that come in all the running, so it really gets our joints stronger. It allows us to have a lot more power in our training, and also reduces the fatigue aspect, so we don't feel as battered after every single run. if our body is nice and strong and we've got a really good, strong base to work off of or push off of. Some of the key aspects, and I refer to strength training, people often get concerned and they think we're forcing you to get into a gym. That's really not the case. But we refer to more resistance training, if you like. And what is quite key here is to start off slow. If you're new to strength, you haven't done strength training, body weight exercises are going to be your biggest friend. We often get the question around yoga and Pilates being a form of strength training. They are a good form of strength training, really good for some mobility work, and a good way to start if you are new to strength, where you are utilizing your body's mass or your body weight as resistance. And from there, we really do advise progressing into a little bit more conventional strength work. What do I mean by conventional strength training? I'm going to also add maybe running specific type training to this, but things like doing squats, whether that is just body weight squats and slowly increasing the resistance using weights or resistance bands, but squats, lunges, single leg squats, step ups, those really focus on getting our legs, our joints really strong, as I mentioned, for that solid base to be pushing off of with every stride as a runner. If you're still a little bit unsure on what kind of strength training you can do, we have put together a free strength training plan for you. You can click on screen now and go check that out.
One of the other things that you can do to help keep you injury free is what we call progressive overload. Essentially your progression and how you progress your training. It may seem like an obvious thing, right? But you're not going to suddenly start training and jump into running 2-hour long runs. You're going to slowly build that up over time. And while I say it might sound like an obvious sort of thing, we do see people make these mistakes, and very often that is how they get injured. Doing too much too soon and essentially putting the body under a lot more strain than it needs to, and that is how the body then sort of gives in and we pick up an injury. So progressive overload works as such. So you give the body a stimulus, you do something, and the body breaks down. There's that breakdown that we've spoken about very often, and when we recover is when the body gets a little bit stronger. Okay, so the body breaks down, we give it some recovery, and it gets a little bit stronger. So there we go, we've already got a little bit of progression. And then we put a little bit more load, so that progressive overload, we overload the body again, it breaks down, and it gets a little bit stronger. And so we continue like that, and that is what we term progressive overload. Overloading, bringing it back down, overloading again. And very often you'll see in your running plans is that your plan works like that. It builds for a couple of weeks, and then it comes back down, and then you're overloading a little bit more. So your long runs are no longer an hour and a half, they're now 2 hours a couple of weeks later. Essentially that is that progressive overload. But the key with this is that you don't want to do too much progression too soon, or you don't want that overload to be too much too soon, because that's where we risk injuries.
A big factor is the intensity that we're running at. We all live busy lives, we might be restricted to time, and we might only have 20 or 30 minutes, so we go out there and we bust a lung and we try and run as hard as we can to get what we feel is the most out of the session. Otherwise it almost feels as though we've wasted our time, we haven't really done anything. And that is a surefire way to make sure you are going to get injured somewhere down the line. The reason we say this and the reason we talk about intensity is really running too much intensity. Keep in mind with the intensity, if we just go into a little bit of a physiological or a physical breakdown of what that means and unpack this a little bit more. If we talk muscle contractions, you get two types of muscle contractions. The first one is what we call a concentric contraction. That concentric contraction is our push-off phase. So think about your run, you're pushing off the ground each time. If you imagine my fingers as the muscle fibers, the concentric contraction is where those muscle fibers, your muscle shortens. So there's a lot of muscle fibers in contact with each other. That is generally a really strong contraction that we refer to, and there's generally a pretty low risk of injury in a concentric muscle contraction. The flip side of that is then the eccentric contraction, and this is the landing phase. This is almost the braking force that comes into our training, and especially when we're doing undulating routes and a lot of downhill type running. What an eccentric contraction is now is our muscle lengthening. As you can see, as the muscle lengthens, there's less muscle fibers in contact with each other. So that almost puts the muscle at a more vulnerable position. It's a higher risk of injury, and it is at this point that we really want to make sure we are not doing too much intensity, which leads to even more of that eccentric training load, putting our muscles in a more vulnerable position more often. And that is why we really want to focus on reducing the intensity. I'm not saying all those runs should be at low intensity, but making sure we're not doing too much intensity in the week and all of our runs at higher intensity. If we can reduce that risk of injury, we are then looking at prolonging our running injury-free for a lot longer. So just to make sure you're getting those intensities right, check out the video on screen now where we've dived into getting the proportion of our lower intensity and higher intensity runs spot on to make sure we do reduce this risk of injury.
One of the keys to staying injury-free is recovery, and one of the cornerstones of recovery is nutrition. I'm going to focus specifically on nutrition that's linked directly to recovery from sessions, and that is really what we call the golden window for recovery straight after, in particular, high intensity exercise or long duration exercise. The first 30 to 45 minutes is the most important period for post-exercise nutrition to help speed up recovery, and we are trying to achieve two things during this period. The first is that we want to replace muscle glycogen that was used during exercise, and that is most effective immediately after exercise when your muscles are most receptive to absorbing that muscle glycogen. Outside of that 30 to 45 minutes, reabsorption of muscle glycogen is very, very slow. The second and equally important aspect to post-nutrition recovery is that we want to stop the breakdown of muscle protein that happens during exercise, and we want to promote the resynthesis of muscle protein after exercise. And the sooner you can get in protein after exercise, the better, because as soon as we input protein, it shuts off that catabolism or muscle breakdown, and it promotes the anabolic process or the resynthesis process. And then as long as you provide good, healthy protein as a normal consequence of a balanced diet, your body will then repair itself much better and have you recovering much better and give you a much lower risk of injury.
If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button on screen, and please don't forget to subscribe to the channel. If you really want to know a little bit more on how to stay injury-free and prolong and improve your running, check out the video we've put together that's on screen at the moment that really dives into how smart runners train.